Oh, yes, it is. A little brighter.
Hi, I only have a couple minutes before my class starts on Zoom. I don't know either. I didn't get the other one either. I went way back. I'm not getting it.
Oh, you mean keep the conversation?
That's where we usually go. What about chat? No, it's on second. Yeah. I know. So we need to decide. I sent the same email to Judy. So and I haven't had any response from her either. So last time, the parking was easy, and I don't think the cockroaches bother anybody. They should. Yeah. So I'll call Beth tomorrow and ask her to put it in. Okay. Well, you did a really good job with reservation. I'll let you do it. I'll tell Beth. And we don't need to make it quite this soon.
This meeting is being recorded by a host or a participant.
My class is starting. I know. I don't understand it.
Okay, I think it's about time we get started. I think the sound is working this way.
Bye-bye.
I'm trying a new. You don't hear? I thought it was coming out. Let's see. How's that? Okay. This is sort of weird. I'm trying a new mechanism. I brought in my iPhone and I signed on that way. And then I can hear what the people on Zoom are hearing, which I don't hear very well otherwise, but maybe if they come out there, I will. But I discovered that thanks to that, I can hear you people. Because I hear you better if you come in through this and go to Zoom and come back than I do if it's just two people. That's just because of my hearing. But so maybe if I put my headphones on, it doesn't mean I decided to listen to music in the middle of class or something. It's just that I'm trying to pick up people, overcome my poor hearing. Today we're going to get started on the topic of the logic of arguments. And I think arguments really aren't necessarily all that logical. So we'll look at the nature of the controversial arguments in general. And we'll pick up on that theme as we go through the term and look at other topics. I picked two topics to look at in as sort of case examples here, one of which is abortion. There's always long arguments about abortion. It seems that nobody ever convinces anybody. The opinions are very stable. And so that's one topic. The other is gun control, which is another one that there's a lot of argument about. There's a lot of actual research involved with gun control and data and so on. I don't think with the abortion issue, there's really much in the way of data that's influences things. So we'll look at both of those, but first I'm going to look at the logic of argument and some of the errors that people are supposed to make in argument. Now, some of this looks like formal logic, but the logic is incorporated in opinion essays that people write, in speeches that people make, in conversations. It's just not formalized in that way. So we're looking at the implicit structure of these things. Let me put the slides up, and we'll look at some of the things that I put on the slide. This is chapter 4 of the book, The Language of Logic. Logic is a technical subject. You can take college classes in logic, and you'll find very soon they go to mathematical logic, and they go to special symbols. You see all of these symbols here, and if you take a course in logic, you have to learn all of these symbols.
You need to screen share.
Why do they do that? They do that because words are so imprecise.
Hello, Ted.
Don't have a fixed definition. People use them differently. They change. On
Earth
the other
calling
hand, in our
Ted.
ordinary
Earth calling
conversation, we
Ted.
usually use words. We never use these symbols.
I don't think
if
he
you
can
look
hear
at-
us.
at logic,
Hey,
it's
Ted,
study
Dad,
valid rules of inference.
hey, Ted.
Okay?
Can't hear you,
You're not hearing it now?
or I don't, somebody's yelling or saying something from home.
Ed,
Screen share.
Screen
Ted.
share, screen
Screen
share.
Screen share.
Oh, the screen share is, what is,
It's not up.
The Zoom people can't.
the Zoom people aren't hearing?
You're not seeing on the screen, screen share.
Screen
I thought
share.
they, just about they were. Huh. No, it's not. Let's see. Select a speaker, just speaker and microphone. You hear a ringtone?
They can hear you, but they can't see you.
And what you're saying, you can hear, but you can't see?
Yes, we can hear
can't see the
you,
screen share.
but we can't see the screen share.
Why would that be?
Good question.
You don't see the screen share on your screen? You see it now?
Yes.
I don't think
Yes.
there's anything different.
Yes.
Well, I'm glad it's working out. Let's see if it continues to work. I don't think anybody but me tries to do dual classes like this, so it can be tricky, okay? You see the definition of logic. It's used in two different senses, in the sense that it's the way we use it in everyday speech, and it's the way we use it in computer programming. In computer programming, everything is very precisely defined. We know exactly how the computer thinks. At least up till now we do. Some of the new computer programs are going beyond that. But in everyday speech, we're using words, they're vague, and I found that the words are often the focus of the argument rather than the logic, but we're getting into that. Today, we're going to deal with words. We're not dealing with mathematical logic. We're not dealing with computer programming. But you'll see that in terms of logic, and that's because computers are more logical than people. Here's some terms that are defined. An argument in logical discourse is a structured set of statements that follow one from the other. in common speech, an argument means two people yelling at each other disagreeing. It means something rather different. If I'm making a reasoned statement, I don't really call that an argument. I have an argument with my wife when we're angry at each other. In logical theory, they use argument as a set of structured arguments. A syllogism is one particular structure that's discussed. There are many others. We'll get into the syllogism better on the next slide. Rationalizing is where you make up an argument because you want to reach a certain opinion and you somehow adjust things so it fits. And that's, I think, what people do a lot of the time. They don't start with a assumption and look at its consequences. They start with, I'm against abortion. Why is abortion wrong? Let me come up with the reasons. Or I'm against assault weapons, and they come up with reasons. In really logical analysis, you should reach your conclusions based on your analysis, which would be reason. And most of us like to say that we are reasonable, but other people are not. Let me give you an example of a syllogism. This is a better explanation than the one in the book, I think. You start with a major premise and a minor premise leads to a conclusion. So here's one that I put up. My major premise is blondes are dumb. My minor premise is Hillary Clinton is a blonde. And my conclusion is Hillary Clinton is dumb. Is that a valid argument?
No.
In terms of the everyday use of the word valid, it's not. But as logicians talk, that's valid because if you accept the first two statements, the third does follow. So they would say it's logically valid, even though it's not sound. So they make a distinction between a valid argument and a sound argument. Now, what's wrong with that argument right at the beginning is the idea that blondes are dumb. There's no evidence that people who are blonde are any dumber than other people. If they're dumb, so is everybody else, I think. So that's false. And once that's false, everything else really doesn't matter. Even the second you could question. I don't know if Hillary Clinton's a blonde or not. I think her hair is so light brown. She probably colors it. Are people who color their hair blonde, does that make them dumb? Or you have to be born blonde? You can raise questions about the premises. And that is really more significant than the logic itself. The logic itself looks at the structure of the argument and is the structure okay? And then if the structure is okay, they say you've got a valid argument, but you've got to feed in sound data. And that's just an example of how words are used in different ways. In sociology, when we talk about valid, we mean that we have a measurement that really measures the concept we have. We use it differently. And in everyday speech, I think valid means correct. It doesn't mean that there's a logical structure that follows. So that can be confusing when you look at the logical literature. Another common fallacy, he talks a lot about the fallacies in logic, is what's known as affirming the consequent. So you have a consequence. You say, if A, then B, B happened, therefore A must have happened. Such as if my lawyer and the district attorney are in cahoots, I'm doomed for a conviction. That's probably true. If the district attorney and your lawyer are conspiring to convict you, you'll be convicted. He's convicted, he says, aha, they're in cahoots. Now the problem with that is that's not a necessary or sufficient cause of being convicted. You could be convicted because there was a lot of evidence against you that persuaded the jury, and the lawyer did his best to defend you and was not able to do it. So the actual consequence is caused by something else. People typically assume that if something happens, that verifies their theory of what was wrong. So that's a sort of argument that's logically inconsistent. Often in logic, they make a distinction between deductive and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning means you start with an abstract general principle and you derive the consequences. So you're starting with the logic and you're going down. If you look at the hierarchy where the logic is high and the specific events are low. In inductive reasoning, you look at the events and you make a generalization from them. With deductive reasoning, if your principle is sound and if your logic is clear, then your results are guaranteed to be right. With inductive reasoning, that's not the case. Because you can create an explanation for something, but there could be another explanation that also fits the facts. The facts could lead to a number of explanations. The other problem with it is that people don't really think that way. They don't really think inductively or deductively. They think in a mixture and they throw it together. Yeah, Steve.
Could you link the people on the right? They're obscuring part of the writing.
Oh, the people on the screen, Steve, think you're blocking their view. That's a good point. I will minimize that window. There's a philosopher and a scientist, Charles Saunders Peirce, at the end of the 19th century. He's the only really metaphysician of any consequence that I'm aware of in the United States in our whole history. More interesting than Aristotle or Plato or the Greeks. And he came up with the idea of abductive reasoning. And abductive reasoning really looks at a combination of inductive and deductive. It looks at how you generalize to a theory. And you can generalize to a number of theories and test them. Unfortunately, it's very hard to understand in his writing. He was a great thinker, but a poor writer. John took it out of the book. In the draft I have, he referred to it. What he put in instead was something called the search method, developed by Schick and Vaughan, which is really a popularization of abductive reasoning. It's really a more effective, more understandable version of it, much better to apply. So you see that what you do with the search method is, first of all, you start with a claim. It's very rare that people look at something with a totally open mind, no idea about it. That is an ideal for some people, mostly anthropologists. Anthropologists believe in doing that. They're going to study some tribe. Maybe they're the first person to ever go there. They just set up a tent, live there, and see what happens. And then they make generalizations about it, and they get a lot of good information that way. But they certainly go in with some idea of what's going to be happening. They have an idea of how other cultures work, what hunting and gathering societies are like, and how men and women relate. They don't really have an open mind. So you go back and forth, you look at what's happening, you contrast it to your ideas and say, well, is it fitting or not? And you hope that it doesn't, maybe because then you can come up with some new ideas, which is more interesting than if you just find what you expected. So what you do is you look at all the evidence for something, and then you evaluate the alternative hypotheses. You create hypotheses about it, and then you evaluate all of the different theories and see which one works better. He refers to that as Occam's razor, which is a logical device people talk about, which says that you go with a simpler explanation. I don't think it's not just simpler, it's also the one that requires the fewest strange, unusual, weird assumptions. If you can explain something simply, you don't need to go to something more complex. It doesn't prove that the more complex is wrong, but you're better off, as a rule, going with the simpler one. So if a tree fell down, oh, there was a lot of wind, it blew it down, rather than that two meteorites came, one hit the tree and knocked it down, and The other hit the meteorite, obliterating the evidence. That's extremely implausible. That's probably too extreme an example, but often you see cases like that. Here's one that I just happened to see in the press yesterday. What explains Bigfoot? Many people say they've seen this strange humanoid creature living in the mountains here in the United States. They never quite get a picture of him, whatever. This guy did a study and he said, well, one theory is that people are mistaking black or brown bears for Bigfoot. Now, how do you know that? You can't know that in any one case. If somebody says, I saw Bigfoot, you can't tell them they didn't. But he looked at the correlation between the population of bears and a number of reports. And he found that there's lots of reports of Bigfoot in communities where there's a lot of black bears or brown bears, and there's not very many when there aren't bears. That gives you another hypothesis to explain what's happening. And that fits the data. It fits the data about the distribution of answers. Often you can prove something about a statistical distribution, but not about specific cases. That's usually the case with medicine. You can't definitively prove why my grandfather got cancer. He smoked, he got cancer, but did the smoking cause the cancer? You can't say that for sure. He might have gotten it anyway. But you can say that as a statistical pattern, people who smoke are more likely to get cancer. So you can look at a pattern and establish something that you can't establish with individual cases, which is a lot of what sociology is about, looking at these general patterns rather than specific cases. Now, that gives you a simpler explanation of the Bigfoot phenomenon. It really seems very implausible that there's this whole population of large humanoid animals. Nobody's ever gotten a photograph of one, gotten close to one over the years. It's very implausible. Some people prefer to believe the implausible. And that makes for a better TV show. The same thing with lights in the sky. Maybe that's a flying saucer from another galaxy. That would be much more exciting. I have an article from a journalist who he would just love to break the story that the aliens are here. It's been covering this for years, and somehow they never show up. They never land. They never come down and say, take me to your leader. It's always these lights in the sky and lifts. And after a while, people get tired of that. And you could say, well, there's something wrong with the radar or something. Come up with a simpler explanation, or at least one that requires fewer unusual assumptions. So that's one of the things about logic. There's a number of different, these are pseudo-logics. I think I skipped ahead here. Logical fallacies. Logical fallacies in common speech. Non sequitur means you say something that really doesn't follow from the first. Not follow. Sometimes that's given it, I guess that's Latin. Argument from authority. This must be partly because my grandfather said it, and he always tells the truth. That's an argument from authority. Ad hominem means you dismiss something because of some characteristic of the person who's saying it. There's something wrong with them. Post hoc ergo propter hoc means something happened and something else happened. There's a time sequence, therefore it must be a cause. An example was the rooster crowed this morning and then the sun came up. That would be a post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is given in Latin. Traditionally, that's given in Latin. Argument from ignorance says there's no evidence for this. That proves it must be true because they're so good at covering it up. It's really part of conspiracy theory logic. Rhetorical persuasion means you use warm, fuzzy sounding words to make something sound good. Those are all part of how people actually conduct arguments rather than the formal logic. I went through and looked for some cases. People died of cancer before cigarettes were invented. So smoking doesn't cause cancer. What error is that person, is that making? Maybe making more than one, or maybe it's not necessarily one or the other. I don't have a multiple choice test here. Yes, thank you.
Post hoc ergo propter hoc.
I think, yeah, it's post hoc ergo propter hoc. One didn't happen after, it happened before. It's also, I think, maybe a non sequitur, although it was up there to illustrate post hoc ergo propter hoc. Now that gets into the idea of what's a cause. If you go back to Aristotle and say you've got a necessary cause, that means you have to smoke to get cancer. It's not a necessary cause. People get cancer who never smoked. And neither is it a sufficient cause. If you smoke, it's not guaranteed that you're going to get cancer. But when we talk about cancer today, causes today, it's a matter of statistics and probability. It's more likely, it happens more often because there are a lot of other causes. There's always multiple causes. And you want to get some idea of how strong the causal relationship is. You can say there's a cause, it's likely to cause it, but how much? And that's what's often hard to communicate. I know with medical things, you're going to get AIDS, you're going to get COVID. In fact, the risk of getting COVID was much, much higher than the risk of getting AIDS from any sort of contact. The risks are, and we don't know often how big the risk is. Some things, the risk is so tiny we can ignore it altogether. When you go out to your car after class, it's possible that a meteorite will come down and smack you dead. That could happen. As far as I know, it has never happened to any human being. I'm not aware of any case where a meteorite actually hit somebody. So the probability of that is very, very close to zero. It's not zero. Some things it's very high. It's hard to judge. Like suppose you went out and bought a new car and you bought a new assault rifle. Which is more likely to kill somebody in the next year?
Car.
I wouldn't have brought that up if it was the assault rifle, obviously. So you're more likely to kill somebody with the car than with the rifle. So we can say it's dangerous for people to have assault rifles. It's dangerous for people to have cars too. We know that. We accept that risk and we try to minimize it. And we could try to minimize the other risk. Maybe we say they don't need assault rifles at all, get rid of them. We're not going to get rid of cars, go back to horse and buggy. So, we're making a judgment based on how likely something is, as well as the consequences. There's also what we call pseudo-logic, which means it sounds logical, but it isn't. And these are common arguments. There's more than these, but there's a slippery slope. Slippery slope means once you start with this, it'll keep getting worse and worse and all hell will break loose. False dilemma means, you've got to be this. If you're not this, you're that. You're not with us, you're against us. Usually you could just be uninterested or you could be for something else. Moving the goalpost means you give somebody a challenge to accomplish something. If they accomplish it, you say, well, that wasn't really good enough. We want more evidence. That's been the frustration of the people in the psi community who look at extrasensory perception and so on. They meet the statistical standards that people have said. So people say, well, we need a higher standard. We don't believe it anyway. Probably we do need a higher standard. Our standards are generally too low. We'll get into some of that. Special pleading means you make an exception. Now, I believe in free speech, but not if it's denying the Holocaust, or not if it's attacking women, or not in this particular case. And maybe that'll work. You look at Holocaust denial. In Germany, they made that illegal. Now, some people would say that's the slippery slope. Once you make that illegal, every other cause is going to want their things illegal. and you're gonna have to illegal everything. So in our country, we allow people to be Holocaust deniers. They have their websites, they publish their stuff. Nobody takes them very seriously. In Canada, they can. In empirical fact, it hasn't created a slippery slope. And a slippery slope isn't something that happens logically, it's something that may happen. And you have to evaluate how likely is it. So in Germany, they have free speech about just about everything except Nazi Holocaust. So it is, sometimes that works out. Hasty generalization means you look at one or two cases and you generalize to the whole population. Usually selected cases, you find a case that suits you and you generalize from that, but maybe just an accidental one. Countless counterfeit means there's so many cases of this, even though all the ones I've looked at are false, some of them must be true. Where there's smoke, there must be fire, must be happening. We'll look at that next week when we look at the big daycare panic that swept the country. I keep getting reports from kids about things that happen. And many of the reports were fantastic. It was like, oh, they brought a giraffe and a hippopotamus came into our daycare center and such. And people say, well, kids will say anything, but kids are saying so many things, some of them must be true. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but that basically says, well, you did it, you can't blame me for doing it, which psychologically works, logically it doesn't work. Straw man means you invent a counter argument that you can easily deny. My opponents believe that all babies should be suffocated, therefore you make up something that isn't really what they think, and then it's easy to deny. Let's look at this one. This is why I took off of the Gab social network last week. Screw all Democrats and rhinos. If you are not America first, then you are the enemy. A rhino is a Republican in name only. Now, what is that? Which one of the pseudo-logics does that illustrate? You're not one, you're the enemy. This is a false dilemma. You've got to either be with me or you're the enemy. There's a lot of people who don't have an opinion at all, who think something else. Activists typically make that sort of argument. If we legalize marijuana now, next they will legalize all the other drugs and then crime will explode. What is the pseudo logic there?
Hasty generalization. Slippery slope. Slippery slope.
It's certainly a slippery slope. It's saying you start with one thing and go to all the others. That might or might not happen. We could legalize marijuana and not legalize heroin, for example. There's no guarantee that one is going to lead to the other. It's possible. Also, the question that crime will explode, that's very debatable too. There's no evidence that legalization of drugs causes more crime. It seems that prohibition of drugs causes more crime. Awful lot of crime between drug gangs. If you look at prohibition of alcohol, that was supposed to eliminate crime. That was the theory. Get rid of drunken brawls, like found guy got in and stabbed somebody, or they're getting drunk. They should stay home and be sober. But the actual consequence was you had gang warfare between people who were smuggling alcohol and so on. And crime rate actually went up. So there's a question there too. But that's a typical argument. We can't legalize marijuana because then they'll want everything legalized. Maybe that man isn't really stuffing a ballot box, but there have been so many reports of ballot box stuffing that some of them must be true. This one actually relates to a movie called 2000 Mules that shows a prominent picture of a man putting ballots in one of these deposit boxes. And they point, this shows a conspiracy to stuff the ballot box. somebody went out and looked up who that was, found the man, and he brought in 3 or 4 ballots from his family members, which was legal under the law in that state. He hadn't done anything. I say, well, that one case maybe wasn't right, but there have been so many cases, some of them must be right. That's what we call the countless counterfeit. There's many, many things that are wrong, but if there's so many wrong things, some of them must be right. If it's flooded with counterfeit $100 bills, there's so many of them, some of them must be good. I wouldn't take one on that theory if I were you. They're all wrong, or most of them are. So that's one that you will see. This is one that I made up last week. A child born of a black father and a Filipino mother will be a great golfer. That's clearly a hasty generalization. I've taken one case and I've said, well, that applies to everybody with that situation. Clearly, one would want to look at data and see whether it's generally true, which it seems highly implausible that it's generally true. So that's an example of a hasty generalization. This is one also from last week. Remember, we talked about the case of the first week of the film festival in New York. They had a principle, they don't censor not films, they're plays. They put on plays, they choose them at random, they don't censorship, anything goes. But they said our commitment to freedom of expression does not obligate us to lend our efforts to platform that which we consider to be hate speech, or even just very offensive and hurtful speech. On platform, they mean give a platform to, give them a place to express it. They're not pressing it, they're just not putting it on their festival. This is an example of special pleading, saying we believe in this principle in general, but not in this one case. This case is, we're going to make an exception. Typically, people do that with religion. Somebody burns a Koran in Sweden. In Swedish law, you can do that. But they say you can say anything you want, but you can't burn the Koran. That is an exception. Many things can be made an exception. In this case, the exception was questioning whether people can really change their gender and become female when they're male. That many people do question that, but they felt that's too offensive. Now, Elon Musk has gotten into this recently. He took over Twitter. He said he was a free speech fundamentalist. He believed in everything being free. Problem with that is it turns off the advertisers. Advertisers don't want to be on a network that's got a lot of anti-Semitism or objectionable material. They'll advertise someplace else. And his company will go broke if he does that. So he changed his policy. The Gab people say we'll do anything, which they really do. Because they're a far-right Christian nationalist group, but you can put anything up there, get on and make any argument. So they're purists, but that means they don't get advertising from major corporations. They have to raise money from their supporters, and they have alternative sources. So it's making a special pleading. Here's another one. All sports car drivers are so aggressive. Sports car driver cut him off. Whenever you see something like that, all generalizing from a limited experience, that's a hasty generalization. So those are logical arguments that are out there. Here's one. I want to feel safe in school. Who doesn't want to feel safe? We all want to feel safe. We want to feel safe here too, at work, whatever. That's rhetorical persuasion. It's saying their argument really is that we should pass gun control legislation, and that's going to make things safer. That's an empirical argument that you'd have to make and defend with some kind of data or something. just saying I want to feel safe is giving a good feeling, getting you to identify with this girl. I hope she feels safe. Certainly want kids to feel safe. Does that mean we should have the teachers carry guns so they can ward off people? Or does that mean we should outlaw guns, or we should put more money into mental health care, or what can we do about it? That's not so easy. Here's one. Your argument is not valid. My dad can beat up your dad. That would be an argument from authority. My dad is bigger, he's taller, he's stronger, therefore what he says is right. That doesn't actually prove that what he says is right. Baseball players are headed south for spring training. Pretty soon the geese will all fly back north. Somebody needs to look into what those guys are doing to the geese.
Yeah.
What is that? Well, it is certainly a case of post hoc ergo propter hoc. Baseball players went south and the geese came north. Of course, they're both caused by something else. They're caused by the change of seasons. They go south when it's warm and the geese come north in the summer. However, this could be a case of goose abuse, which would be a nice thing to talk about. That would be a rhetorical persuasion, finding a clever phrase for something. Here's one that comes from Earl Warren, who was then California's Attorney General. This was a congressional hearing back in 21st February 1942, just half a year before I was born, so I'm not responsible. He was talking about legislation to remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast, which was passed. People who were of Japanese descent, even though they were American citizens, were forced to leave their homes and move away from the West Coast states. My parents were actually involved with opposing that. My father took a job at a relocation center in Utah where they relocated people. He was the high school counselor. That's why the first words I ever spoke were Japanese. Of course, I remember absolutely nothing of Japanese, but he says, I take the view that this lack of enemy subversive activity on the West Coast is the most ominous sign in our whole situation. It convinces me more than perhaps any other factor that the sabotage we are to get, the fifth column activities are to get, are timed, just like Pearl Harbor. I believe we're being lulled into a false sense of security. So he's saying the fact that nothing has happened, none of the Japanese Americans have done anything, is evidence that they're getting ready to do it. They're going to jump on us all at once and we've got to get rid of them. That would be argument from ignorance, argument from lack of information. The less information there is, the more devious they are in hiding it. Interestingly enough, they did not remove the Japanese Americans from Hawaii, which is where Pearl Harbor is and what's closer to Japan, because they're a much larger segment of the population, more influential, whatever. And there really wasn't any subversive activity from Japanese Americans either. Nor did they remove German Americans from the East Coast or Italian Americans. Yes, Maggie.
When you said that, I was remembering when I was a student in Hawaii, I went to the memorial to, what is the ship that sank and still there? The Arizona. And I went with my friend Cheryl Yushiroda, and there was a young man who was standing guard there, and he made a very insulting comment to her. And I remember as we were leaving, she said, "We'll look at you the next time."
You see this a lot with contemporary conspiracy theories. If you don't have evidence, that proves how devious they are with it, which is hard to disprove. So those are some logical flaws, logical problems that we may be looking at in this class. Last week I vaccinated my child. Today he began acting autistic. Therefore, the vaccine caused the autism. That's certainly a post hoc ergo propter hoc. One thing happened and another happened. There must have been a cause. And you can't really establish that on one case. That's the problem with that. To know whether a vaccine causes autism, you'd have to look at a lot of cases and see whether there's a statistical pattern. Whether kids who get vaccinated become autistic and those who don't do not. You can't judge something like that from a single case, but people feel strongly often about single cases. I hummed a tune about clouds and it rained, so cloudy hums change the weather. People often do these sort of things, like I wore a red shirt and I won the game, therefore I'm going to always wear a red shirt when I play this game. You buy lottery tickets. And lottery is something we know is random chance. That's the nature of a lottery. People will still believe, well, this or that influenced my outcome. If I buy it on my birthday, I'm more likely to win or something. All of those are post hoc ergo propter hoc. Here's one that I found the one on the left, and then I tried to look for one from Biden. This is a poster for Donald Trump, and all it lists is words. It doesn't say anything about the words. I think that's rhetorical persuasion. You're trying to say, he's freedom, he's prosperity, he's knowledge. You're not making an argument that will be more prosperous under him, although maybe that's implicit. With Biden, I couldn't find a similar poster, but you could say the Build Back Better slogan. Slogans in general are rhetorical. You don't try to use words that convey a good feeling. Who doesn't want to build back better? I mean, it's a way of convincing people with your rhetoric, with your choice of words, rather than with logical statements. So those are some that we look at. You wouldn't understand, since you never had to struggle. You don't actually care about the diversity initiative. You just want to generate press. The reason you don't understand this is because you're stupid. These are all ad hominem. They're blaming the person. It's a problem with you. Personal arguments, you get into that a lot. People blame their wife or their husband because you don't care, whatever. Whether what they said is true or not is secondary. It's really who you go with that may matter in a relationship. A search method means you start with an initial claim, examine the evidence, consider alternatives, and evaluate the credibility of each alternative. How do you do that? It's not easy. If you're a scientist, you can evaluate them by doing your own research. You can go back and read the original research. But you can only do that on one topic, even if you're an expert, like Linus Pauling, who's the world's greatest chemist. When he looked at the question of does vitamin C cause cancer, he didn't do original research, he just looked at the research that was out there. So you want to look at what credible experts say, look for disconfirming information, ask critical questions, see if there's a consensus. Now, some things there is a consensus. So things like the earth is round rather than flat. There is no astronomer who disagrees. It's 100%. Usually there's some oddball who disagrees somewhere, and it's not impossible that they're right, but the chances that they're right is very, very slight. So that's what we're going to be looking at in specific cases. If we're going to go beyond just believing our own presuppositions, we're going to have to look at alternative hypotheses, evaluate the credibility of each one, and reach a conclusion. Otherwise, I think you can you can make an argument for almost anything if it's pure logic. This is an example. I didn't give you a chance to read it. Suppose you were to write a persuasive essay. Now, with a persuasive essay, you have a series of arguments that reach a conclusion, and you start with a conclusion. Now, the essay I'm going to show you was written by an artificial intelligence. Some of you I did a class on artificial intelligence. We looked at one that writes essays, writes statements. Since then, they've come out with one that's a whole lot better, that's been getting a lot of attention. And it will write an essay on any topic you want and come up with a logical argument and defend it. And this is causing great problems in public schools because students are assigned to write an essay. They can load this thing up, have it write an essay, it'll be original. You can't use the plagiarism checker because they didn't copy it from someplace else. They got it from there. So this person gave the topic of write a persuasive essay in favor of pooping in your pants. So, oops, we're going the wrong way here. Here is a persuasive essay on pooping in your pants. Pooping in your pants may seem like an embarrassing, uncomfortable situation, but there are actually several benefits of letting go and letting it all out into the pants. Here are just a few reasons why you should consider pooping in your pants. Pooping in your pants can save you time. Instead of spending minutes or even hours sitting on the toilet, you can simply let go and continue with your day. This can be especially helpful when you're in a rush or have other pressing considerations. 2, pooping in your pants can improve your mental health. Holding in poop can cause a buildup of toxins in the body, which can lead to feelings of anxiety and stress. By pooping in your pants, you can release these toxins, feel more relaxed and at ease. Pooping in your pants can be good for the environment, because flushing a toilet uses a lot of water, which can be wasteful and damaging. You conserve water, reduce your environmental impact. It can be a liberating experience. Society often tells us we need to hold in our poop and only release it, but this can be constraining and unnatural. By pooping in your pants, you can let go of these societal norms and embrace your body's natural instincts. In conclusion, pooping in your pants may not be the most conventional or socially acceptable behavior, but it has a multitude of benefits that are worth considering. From saving time and improving mental health to helping the environment and providing a sense of liberation, pooping in your pants is a truly worthwhile experience. Okay. We will have a bathroom break here. I'm not suggesting that you try that. What's wrong with this? Is there something illogical here?
That's being
Have they
disgusting.
violated some rule of logic? I don't think it's not a hierarchy in the sense that one thing follows from the other. So you can't really debate it that way. It's
Well, the environment is not sound because you're going to wash your clothes and use more water.
okay. So you may use more. Let's assume you're hung up on having clean clothes. That's another societal expectation. Now, if we use the search method, we would have to say, well, what are other consequences of pooping in your pants, such as the fact that you will stink and nobody will want you around, and you will be uncomfortable and you'll get a diaper rash. And, you could think of other consequences. And then you could do a cost benefit analysis and say, are these benefits worth it against the cost or something? But you can make an argument for just about anything. And a computer can do that for you. Now, people who study debating, I don't know if anybody here belonged to a debating club and when you're in a debating club, as I understand it, you're supposed to be ready to go with either side. So you have a proposition that you're going to debate. There's two teams, and you draw straws to decide which side you're going to be on. And then you should be prepared to argue both, which I think is an excellent learning experience, because you learn that there are arguments on both sides. For many things there are. I think pooping in your pants is not an example. It really can be plausible on either side, but if you have many of the issues like gun control and abortion that we're going to look at, there are arguments on both sides that people take seriously. It's certainly a good training for somebody who wants to become a lawyer. That's the nature of law, is you're supposed to be prepared to argue for your client. And if your client is on one side, you argue that side. If your client's on the other side, you argue the other side. That's different from, say, a social scientist, where you get up and you're supposed to be seeking truth. Your goal is to have accurate information. I got into that with the welfare reform. I came as an expert witness. I'm supposed to say what are likely consequences of the reforms that they were making, rather than starting out that they're good or they're bad. And just lawyers tend to think that way. And that's one of the problem with logic, is that you can structure things logically and you can go on either side. There is the question of whether the evidence really supports it or not. And that gets more into the science that we talked about last time, trying to evaluate the evidence or the causes of something. So if I were teaching a course with assignments, I could give you the assignment to write a persuasive essay on one thing or another. But you would probably find the chat bot and have the chat bot write it for you anyway. So probably would. That's what they're going to start having people writing their essays in class and so on, rather than take-home tests or essays and so on. That's how the technology improves things or changes things. Okay, I think this is a good time to take our break, and we'll come back. We're going to look at the debate on abortion. If we have time, we'll get to gun control. If we don't, push gun control off to next week. We'll see how long we want to get into on the abortion. I think the abortion is all rhetoric and very little science. There's not really disagreement about the science in that field. This biology of human reproduction is pretty well understood, but people draw different conclusions from it. So we'll take our break maybe till 7 after 4. It's now 3:57, so 10 minutes. I'm going to turn off the recording here. When you watch the recording or something like this, you don't have to watch the whole thing. You can always just move the cursor along and watch whatever part you want to watch. So we're going to get started now. I'm going to go on. Now, when you come to the look at the PowerPoints, I have a separate PowerPoint. I have one on abortion arguments, one on gun control, and then there's one for the general discussion we had today. So you'll find this discussion on a separate PowerPoint. We go with the share screen, share sound. And you should be seeing arguments on abortion on your screen. You people in Zoom land, is that coming through? You see everything? Wave at me anyway. I don't know how many people are back. Okay, we're going to get started here. We're going to look at the arguments on abortion. I just researched this for this class. It's not a field that I've studied public opinion on abortion, which is a little different topic. Here I'm trying to look at arguments. There is a website called procon.com, which lists the pro and con arguments most common on both sides of controversial issues. So it's a good place to go. The pro, this is number one, abortion is a safe medical procedure that protects lives. And they have statistics on that. The death rate of abortions as opposed to the death rate of other medical procedures, which tends to be higher. Having a baby is riskier. Of course, they would say that doesn't count the life of the fetus, but counting the life of the already living people, that seems to be true. The con argument, life begins at conception, making abortion murder. Now that has to do with, it's not really so much empirical evidence, it has to do with the definition of words. What is life? Is an egg that's not fertilized alive, or is it dead? How about sperm? Sperm are alive. I paid $10,000 to have my son-in-law's sperm mated with my daughter's egg on a Petri dish after they wanted to have a third child after losing one child. So they were alive. On the other hand, this argument, she goes into a more detailed argument. I pull this website up and we can look at some of their statements. Life begins from the moment of conception when the sperm fertilizes the egg, because there is the creation of a new, totally distinct, integrated organism or a human being, which is going to be biologically distinct from all other life forms. We're never getting again into definitions of words. Is that zygote a human being? You're talking about a cell, there's maybe one or two cells at the very beginning. It's a tiny microscopic thing you can't even see, but it has the DNA that will become a human being, that will guide the development into a human being. And when it says ending a life is murder, is abortion murder? Murder is defined by law, actually, so you have a definition. There isn't any state in the United States where abortion is murder by legal definition. It could be changed. If the anti-abortion movement gets strong enough, they could change it and say that it is murder. In El Salvador, they're closer to that. They're closer to, it's punishable with a long prison term. I don't think they even there, they call it murder. On the other hand, you might say that murder is not what's defined in law, it's what it really means. And you get into the real definition of words, and that's what you get into in the anti-abortion argument. We'll get into more of that later. Abortion bans endangers healthcare for those not seeking abortions. In terms of people who have a miscarriage, my wife had a miscarriage between her two pregnancies, which is also known as a spontaneous abortion. That's what it's called in Spanish. She didn't cause that to happen, she didn't want it to happen, but when you go to the hospital, if you need treatment, you say, well, I had a miscarriage, they may not believe you, so that's a problem. Legal abortion promotes a culture in which life is disposable. Now that, I think, is a slippery slope argument, and it would have to be supported with evidence. Isn't the case where life is more disposable in states that have legal abortion and those that don't? Is there some evidence that this has happened? Slippery slopes may happen, but they're not guaranteed. Just because you can allege one doesn't prove that it exists. So those are the arguments that the website comes up with.
That con number 2, though, assumes that con number 1 is valid.
What's that?
con number 2 assumes con number 1 is valid.
So there's a hierarchy here. Con number 2 assumes that con number 1 is valid. Let's see, con number 2, legal abortion promotes a culture in which life is disposable.
That's assuming life is defined
Begins at birth.
in the cells.
That's assuming that that the fetus is alive, which it is.
Yeah, but
It's not dead.
it goes back to the, when the cell is fertilized, when the egg is fertilized. That's when life begins, according to number 1.
Right.
I think that's really a question of how you define the word. When does life begin? I think life is continuous.
That's right.
It began a billion years ago, and we pass it on from one organism to another. But it's a new, distinct individual is created. So if you phrase it that way, it's true. Increased access to birth control, health insurance, and sexual education would make abortion unnecessary.
That's
Certainly
true.
should make abortion less frequent. I don't think you could argue it would never be necessary.
That's true.
As Bill Clinton said, abortion should be legal and infrequent, safe, legal, and rare. Abortion bans deny bodily autonomy, creating wide-ranging repercussions. That's also a slippery slope. It denies the women the autonomy of their own body. That's true. But to say that it has implications for other things and bodily autonomy will be denied in general is a slippery slope argument. And it has to be defended. You have to look for evidence for that rather than just assert it. So there are arguments there. It seems to me the arguments, people are talking past each other. I don't know if anybody on Zoom has a comment. Just raise your hand or speak up. I can put on my headphones and try to hear you. Maybe I hear you through the speakers in the room. So wave at me or something, or just speak up and interrupt if you're on Zoom. Now I opened the wrong one. This is abortion arguments that we want to open. Here's a slogan that you see. Abortion stops a beating heart. That's, I think, rhetorical persuasion in the sense that it's using the term heart as if the heart was the organ of emotion, of feeling. We use the heart for a Valentine. Actually, the heart is just a pump. It's really the brain that has all of the feelings and so on. It's also only true in late-term abortions, which are a very small percentage of abortions. Very early-term abortions, there's no beating heart. So the beating heart is there in the exceptional late-term abortion once the heart has developed. But you get that in terms of discussions with activists. I'm sure if we're going to have time for these discussions, we can come back to them if we do. I'm not going to start that now. This is a story I got from the New York Times. That's a picture of what actually comes out in an early term abortion. There's no beating heart, there's no organs, whatever. The fetus itself is microscopic. It's in the sac that it's in is visible to the naked eye. There's a certain amount of other stuff that comes out. This was a story put out by a gynecologist who does abortions, wanting to show. If you look at most abortions are like that. They're in the early period. They're not late-term abortions when the fetus has developed organs and feelings and so on. So those are differences. I tried to look for a structured argument about abortion, and this is the one that I found. It's called the Apple argument against abortion. It's by Peter Kreeft, who is a philosopher at Boston University. He actually tries to do a logical step-by-step argument starting with a premise and deriving further statements from it. So you don't find that very often. It's also something that's been reproduced several times. It was published in a Catholic journal, they published it again. A number of newsletters have published it. And it's very widely assigned apparently in Catholic schools. At least I found 3 different websites that offered to write me an essay on it that I could hand in at my high school if I was assigned to read it. So there's a lot of people read this. Now, why is it the apple? Let me read what he says at the beginning. I hope a reader can show me where I've gone wrong on the sequence of steps that constitute this argument against abortion. I honestly wish a pro-choice would someday show me one argument that proved that fetuses are not persons. That seems to be a core argument, fetuses are not persons. Well, I decided that was an interesting challenge. One of the things on the website, so this is published, there's no comment page, there's no place to submit it. But I went onto the Boston College website and I got his email and I emailed him and say, I'm doing this course, I'd be interested, did you get any replies? Do you have anybody who was a pro-choicer who gave you arguments? He didn't seem to have any. And I told him that I was going to do it. So I created a response to his argument. And I don't know how much of this I want you to read. You can find this on my website, on my slides. If you click on something, it takes you to the source. I embed the link in there. So here's his actual argument. I'm not going to subscribe to it right now. It's the apple argument. And he starts and he has 13 propositions. Now, the first proposition is we know what an apple is. That seems odd to me that you're starting with this proposition, we know what an apple is. But the idea is it's like when you talk about a syllogism that you have one principle, and then from that principle you derive the others. And the goal is to have a principle that's so true that it can't be denied, and therefore all of the things that you derive from it can be proved to be correct. So that's what he starts with. We know what an apple is. We really know what an apple is. I don't know why that's important to say, really. If you know something, you know it. If you don't, you don't. But then again, maybe you really know it means you're certain or something. We know what human beings are. We have human rights because we are human. Morality is based on metaphysics. We talked about metaphysics earlier. Metaphysics is general discussion about the nature of the world that's not based on observation, it's based on logic, and that's what he's trying to do. And he comes from that. Moral arguments presuppose metaphysical principles. Might makes right. He's going into other things that are not really directly related. Basically, he ends up with the idea that abortion is wrong because it's fetuses are persons. Okay, let me see now how I get back here to the. You can read this if you want to read it in length. I wrote a response to him. I did a long response, which you can read. I posted it up here. I also sent a shorter response to Crisis Magazine, where they published it originally and said, well, he asked for an answer, why don't you publish the answer? They haven't answered me, they're not interested in publishing the answer. Basically, I started with the beginning. Do we know what an apple is? Well, usually we do, but if you're going to draw an analogy to a fetus, I think that the analogy would have to be to a bud on an apple tree. An An apple starts as a blossom, then it progresses to become a bud, and then it progresses to become an apple. It's not an apple from the moment of conception. I think apples are sexually, you get pollen that comes from one apple tree to another before it gets, becomes a bud and becomes an apple. I'm not really up on the biology of apples, but there is a certain period in the development of an apple when we're not sure whether it's still a bud or whether it's an apple or not. So I would say that if you're going to draw an analogy between the apple and the fetus, which is what he tries to do, I would say that the early gestation fetus is analogous to the bud on an apple tree and not to an apple. And then with time, it becomes an apple. And he didn't really have a disagreement with that argument. He wrote me back. I didn't post his response because he wouldn't send it on email. He only sent it on paper. I could scan it and put it up, but he didn't say I could. Yes.
Just for fun, most apples are grown by grafting.
They're grown by grafting. They still start as a bud, right? They don't start as an apple.
Take a cutting from one tree and a like slice of another tree, put them together.
Well, what is on the graft that they put on? Is it a full-grown apple or is it a?
No, it's just two limbs.
Okay, that is not analogous to human reproduction, so that.
No, but I thought it was.
In their wild or natural state, that's not what happens. In fact, obviously you know a lot more about apple culture than I do. But he's starting with the apple to make that argument. That an apple is a person. Let me show you my response here.
Can you make it larger, Ted?
What?
Can you make it larger so we can read it?
Yeah, I'm not sure I want, if we have time to go through. That's not what I thought it was gonna be. I could find it. That's not my response that goes through the 13 statements one at a time, which I don't think we really need to do. All right, we can look at this version. This is the version that I sent them. If I'm going to make it larger, I think I can go over here and up the
Yeah,
print size. They're too large to fit on the page. Philosopher Peter Kreeft ends his essay, The Apple Argument Against Abortion, with the plea, I hope a reader can show me where I've gone astray in the sequence of 13 steps that constitute this argument. I honestly wish a pro-choicer would show me the one argument that proved that fetuses are not persons. It would save me enormous grief, effort, worry, prayers, and so on. This was published in 2000, reprinted in 2012. And has been reprinted in a number of newsletters. It's assigned to high school students, so it's an influential essay. He offers 13 arguments, but he uses a kind of Socratic logic in which the key points are logically derived from his first point, which is, we know what an apple is, which seems like a strange place to begin. But if you start with this sort of deductive logic, which is what he's using, if your first statement collapses, everything collapses. Everything depends on your first statement. The problem is it's not always true, and exceptions are central to his argument. An apple starts as a blossom, progresses to be a bud, and finally develops into an apple. there is a point in its development where we can't say for sure whether it's still a bud or whether it has become an apple. And that's another argument you get from people in the pro-life movement. They'll say there's no sharp line between a fully developed fetus and a zygote. It's gradual. You can't say at 20 weeks or 16 weeks, suddenly it's changed. Something happens gradually, therefore we can't tell them apart. Which is a faulty argument. You can tell things apart even if the transition is gradual. Same argument you could make for people, the difference between a child and an adult. If we have a 3-year-old, we know that's a child, and a 33-year-old, for certain it's an adult. Even though there's no sharp line between adulthood and childhood. When you wake up on your 18th birthday, you're not suddenly an adult different than you were on the 17 and 11 months. It's gradual. So there's a gradual transition. There's a gradual transition from an apple to a bud. And there's a gradual transition from a zygote to a fully developed baby that can survive outside the womb. But there's no point where it suddenly becomes one. Does that make it a person? Does that mean that it is a person whose life has to be protected? The rest of his argument focuses on the word person. He argues that a fetus is a person and that killing it is murder. Does not extend personhood to sperm or unfertilized eggs, although they're alive and carry DNA. He posits that once the male and female DNA have united, a person is created. What does the word person mean? What is the nature of a word in general? I think words are tools that people invent to communicate, and their meaning changes over time. They're not metaphysical entities that exist forever. That's a metaphysical disagreement. If you go back to Plato, he believed that the words were, or the objects that we see in the real world are materializations of abstractions that are out there. That there is such a thing as a chair, and a chair is an abstract conception created presumably by God or one of the gods or something. And we have different chairs here. They are imperfect realizations, they're all different. And you might draw a question, is a stool a chair? How about if it has 3 legs? Is a bench a chair? How about what's the difference between a chair and a couch or a love seat or something? You could raise empirical questions about that. Now, suppose we want to know what a word means. How do we answer that question? Suppose you wanted to know what the word person means. How would you answer it?
Dictionary.
We have teachers here in the room. Where do you tell the students to figure out what a word means? We go to the dictionary, right? That's what dictionaries are for. They tell you what a word means. The best source for looking at words is the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the most comprehensive dictionary of the English language, and it has literary references of how the word has been used over the last few centuries by writers, philosophers, and so on. So you can look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary. What you find is exemplified by this quote from John Locke, who is an eminent philosopher, one of the best-known philosophers, writing in 1694, "We must consider what person stands for, which I think is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection, and can consider itself as itself." So as he defined a person, it has to be a being that's intelligent, that's aware of itself, that's able to communicate, that knows that it exists. By that definition, a early pregnancy fetus is not a person yet. It's going to become a person. It has the DNA that will allow it to become a person. If you accept that definition, it's not a person. Of course, you can change the definition. And that's probably what they're trying to do. Of course, what does the word person mean to the Supreme Court? Our Supreme Court says that corporations are persons for certain purposes. In order to be able to contribute money to political campaigns and so on. You can use the word person in that way. Many theologians argue that God is a person, and not only that, three persons. There's the three persons of the Trinity in Christian theology. When they say that God is a person, it means it's not just an abstract fixed force. Like you could say a force of nature, a force of gravity or something. It's something that interacts, that expresses itself, that talks to you. You can talk to it, you can pray to it, it will answer you. That's what they mean by the word person. And it doesn't have to be a biological entity, it can be the Trinity. What the Trinity is difficult to understand. It's a very abstract concept, but it's central to a lot of Christian theology. They use the word person. So I think if you take the definitions of the word person that you see in dictionaries, the fetus doesn't really fit. The early gestation fetus does not fit. We're not in the right mode because I switched out. We stopped the share. Started again. Still comes out that way. Here we go, slideshow. These are the definitions I found in the Oxford English Dictionary. In a general philosophical sense, a conscious or rational being is what the word person means according to the Oxford English Dictionary. He has Locke's explanation there, which I just read to you. Here's R. Saunders, 1701. A person is an individual substance having understanding and no part of another thing. We can address God as a person, E.R. Conver, and sustain relations with him, such as are possible only between persons. So God is a person because you can have a conversation, you can talk to God, God will answer you. That's what makes God a person. For every feature of a person or mind regarded as distinctively human, there possibly will exist an analogous feature in a machine or robot. That's the question, is an artificial intelligence a person or not? If it can persuade you and carry on a conversation, pass the Turing test, you might say it's a person. There's a debate about that. Does it have consciousness? At what point does a robot become a person, a conscious being? Will artificial intelligence develop to the point that a computer or robot could qualify as a person? So that's what the word person means in the history of the English language. This unrelated to the abortion dispute. These are the things that the OED published some time ago. And they collected quotes from how the word has been used. That is just a word. You could change the word. I don't think words have that sort of metaphysical nature that there's a true answer. There's lots of words that are confusion and change. And sometimes the words have different meaning. Look at the luggage compartment of a car. In England, that's a boot. Here it's a trunk. And yet it has nothing to do with footwear, it has nothing to do with an elephant's nose or a tree. The fact that you use the word trunk for two different things doesn't make them the same. You often get people making that kind of argument from the definition of words. Take the word rape. What is rape? Rape is a sexual assault. It's also a grain used to produce cooking oil, rapeseed oil. That's just a different, happens to be the same four letters and the same pronunciation, and it means something completely different. And it seems to me that a zygote is very different from a baby. It changes totally over the 9 months of gestation. I don't think they're the same, whether you use the same word or different words. Maybe we lack words. I discovered I'm a grandfather, but in Chinese, I'm paternal grandfather. I have a granddaughter who speaks Chinese. There's a different word for paternal grandfather or maternal grandfather. They're not the same word. So in English, they're the same. In Chinese, they're not. There's no right answer about the words. The words are arbitrary. Now that is, I think, something that Peter Kreeft sort of pretends not to understand when he says he's never heard the answer, because he actually knows what the answer would be. I know that because I find an article he wrote in 1988 where he summarized all of the answers. This was an article in the Journal of Biblical Ethics and Medicine. He says, the very young product of conception, the zygote, has no ability to perform any of the distinctive activities that anyone associates with personhood, such as reasoning, choosing, loving, communicating, not even feeling pain, for the zygote has no brain or nervous system. So he's aware that pro-choice people make that argument. It's not that he hasn't heard the argument. He doesn't accept it because he thinks there's an essence. The essence of personhood is what matters. And if you're a person, you're a person, whether you have the traits of a person or not, whether you have a brain, whether you have feelings, whether you feel pain. They try to argue that the fetus feels pain. That's part of the movie that they show. And at a certain point it does. And that's where there's a transition there. That's what I see as a possible solution. I said I would come up with a solution. My solution would be that we would make abortion legal before 20 weeks and illegal after. We just draw a line. And problem with that is that people who are against abortion are glad to prohibit it after, but they don't want to allow it before. Pro-choice people want to leave it open after, usually only in very exceptional medical circumstances. Late-term abortions are very infrequent, and they're done for a strong medical reason. They're not, people don't put it off. If you deal with people who are raped or 12-year-old children who get pregnant, if you allowed abortion up to a certain date, that would take care of those problems. That would be my solution, which I think may evolve to be the final solution or the way it works out in the United States. It seems like there's an evolution in that direction. I think not that you would persuade the most adamant people on either side, but you might put together enough of a political coalition to pass that sort of a solution. That's the only solution that I can come up with. The other thing that I think is that people are really using these arguments because they think they'll persuade other people, but it's not their real argument, particularly the anti-abortion people. I think their real argument is religious. I think they're really thinking about the soul, which is a theological concept. And the Catholic Church used to think that the soul came in at the period of when this fetus starts to move. They call the ensoulment. Now they say it happens at conception, and you can't answer that. Soul, I think it's really the same thing as the consciousness or the individuality. But I'm not a Catholic. I don't know what a soul is. I think that they're really thinking more of those terms. I think it's also a matter of objection to sexual liberation, the people having sex for entertainment. They want to, they think that people should be more constrained or restricted. There was an interesting article in the Times, how do you stop abortion, in the sense of convincing people to be against abortion. Some of the people said that we change it by having sex be a sacrament, not a recreational pastime. All hearts need to change and realize every life is precious. Prayer would be a solution. Changing minds of people, that life begins with conception. So you want to get people to accept your argument? People need to learn that the biggest gift we got is our lives. Well, I think most people would agree that our life is the biggest gift we've got, I suppose. But that doesn't mean that you would reach that conception. We have time to watch one video here. This is a video I found. This is Peter Kreeft, the same professor. I thought I might invite him to visit our class, but I don't think he would accept. But if people would like to have him visit, I can certainly email him and invite him. I'm going to move this up to 6:45. He does not go into the whole Apple argument. The argument from the Apple seems to have not really hit anywhere. And there's several, I looked at some commentaries on social media where people made the same point that I make, that an apple starts as a bud and a blossom and becomes an apple. That's really a metaphysical difference. If you look at Charles Saunders Peirce, to pronounce it correctly, things evolve and become. His is a metaphysics of becoming. He talks about how things evolve, how they emerge, how understanding evolves, how things develop as a process, as opposed to the earlier Greek Platonic metaphysics that says there are these entities there that are fixed, that are created. I think that's part of the religious mentality, is that there are certain things that are fixed by God that are there that we can, that will always be the same. And that's a metaphysical difference. It's not something you can prove one way or the other. So he starts with that. In this argument, it's mostly all about the word person. I'm going to skip ahead to 6:45 and replay this because it's kind of long.
Let's look at the argument.
If you want to, you can watch the whole thing. It's linked from my slides.
So let's apply that to the question of abortion. In objective fact, either the pro-lifers are right and abortion is murder, or something like it, because the fetus is a human person with rights. With the right to life. It's a fundamental right. You don't have life, you can't have it. Or maybe it's not a person. Maybe the pro-choicer is right. At least the pro-choicer denies the first premise of
You can't see it.
life argument. Maybe the fetus is something less than the person. Maybe it's human but not a person. Maybe it's a person without rights. But it's not the full thing that the pro-lifer thinks it is. Right? Those are possibilities. But here's the key to the argument. Let's factor in the subjective consciousness here. And let's not just talk about belief, but let's talk about knowledge. Because it's not belief, but knowledge that gives you responsibility. You either know what a fetus is or you don't. You're skeptical. You say, I don't know whether it's human or not, or you don't know. Right? Those four possibilities. Either the fetus is a person, you know it, or it's a person, you don't know it, or it's not a person, you know it, and it's not a person if you don't know it. What is abortion in each of these four cases? Well, if the fetus is a person with rights, including a right to life, and you know that, and you nevertheless deliberately choose to kill it, that's the definition of murder. And if it's premeditated, that's first degree murder. Oh, but it's such a small person. That was written about Zeus. Here's a hope. A person is a person no matter how small. But what if the fetus is not a person? Does that make abortion okay? Well, if you know that, yes. If the fetus is not a person, and you know that for sure, then it's absolutely nothing wrong with abortion. It's an operation. It's exciting the cells. And I often honestly confess that I would find it rather relieving if some pro-choice philosopher could prove to me, to my satisfaction, that we can know that the fetus is not a person. Then we can just get up and go home and agree to disagree and back up. And we would have to have such expenditure of time and money and energy and worry about this whole question. It made it a lot easier, but I've never seen it. Never. But only if this thing were done, that I've never seen done, is abortion okay? Because the moment you don't know what a fetus is, let's look at the other two possibilities. You don't know.
Yeah, there we go. We can't let us can see it.
You don't know that it's not a person. You don't know what it is. You should run over the goat. You should. It happens to be your fellow hunter. Oh, I didn't mean to kill it. You know, did you wait to see that that was the second hunter? No, I didn't know what it was. But anyway, you killed a man. That's manslaughter, not first degree murder. You didn't intend murder. You killed a man. You are responsible for that. That's very serious crime. Well, suppose the fetus is not a person. But you don't know that. Suppose the Supreme Court is right. We don't know what a fetus is. And suppose the pro-choicers are right in saying a fetus is not a person. Even so, that's critical negligence. You're just lucky. It happened to be here. You didn't know that. It happened that there were no students left in Georgetown when you didn't know that. It happened that that was a cleverly disguised robot, not a human being. But you didn't know that. It's certainly morally reprehensible. I don't know how you can have that.
It's not screen sharing, Ted.
You didn't get it.
Okay, you see that whole argument is revolving around the word person. And I think that that's, personally, I don't accept the metaphysics that words have some sort of inherent meaning and that whether something is described with a certain word makes a difference. This is not clearly something that everybody agrees with. If you look at Noam Chomsky, famous linguist, but also left-wing polemicist, he believes that words are somehow in the brain. You're born with all the words, and all languages have similar, different sounds and letters, but they're expressing the same words. The words are somehow, there's a deeper level of words that are structured in the brain. Most linguists today don't believe that. I don't think that's true. It's hard to say, like, you take a word like carburetor. Did that exist in biblical times? A word like computer? You know, I think we make up words because something new is invented. We have to call it something, we invent a word for it. And we redefine the words based on the points we want to make. It's not like mathematical logic, computer programming. We know we do that there, but we make up the words explicitly and you define them and you're very rigorous about it. You get a computer to think. In human language and natural languages, words change and evolve. In John Locke's time, nobody thought that a fetus was a person. A person had to have consciousness, had to have the ability to communicate, didn't have to be a physical person. God is a person. The Greek gods were persons too, if you believe in them, they do things. So that's a different definition. They're trying to redefine it. I think it comes from a certain desire to have a truth that is true for all times, that you can rely upon, that's not going to change, that you can look up in an ancient text such as the Bible or the Quran or whatever ancient text you happen to believe in, which is a different mentality from sort of scientific mentality that says that things change and evolve and so on. I think that's the fundamental difference. That's why you're not really getting persuading people. people believe that it's wrong and they're coming up with one argument after another, some of which are clearly defective, like the argument about there's no sharp line between things. There's no sharp line between day and night, really. There's a period of twilight when it's ambiguous whether it's day or night. Not a very long period, but doesn't mean we're not clear. When we go out of here, it's still going to be day and it'll be night in a few hours. So we use arguments like that that clearly don't make sense. Some of the other arguments, it depends on whether you choose to believe them or not. They're not empirically, factually testable. I think the nature of a fetus and what it can do and what it can't do is known. The science about reproduction is not really in dispute in any significant way. What Peter Kreeft says in his essay on biblical ethics and medicine is that the functions don't matter, the description don't matter, there's an essence of the thing. A person is a person all their life, even if they are just a zygote of a tiny cell with microscopic DNA. So that's the argument. Say the solution I have is to draw a line in time, but I don't know that anybody is really happy with. I mean, it's not going to be universally accepted. It may be that some people will accept it. Looks like we're not on screen share anymore, which I thought we were, so I can see the Zoom people there. Does anybody have comments, questions? I put these on, I think I can hear people better. You have time. I assume we have a division of opinion on abortion in our class, or whether we do with any group of people. I don't know if we want to try to get into arguing it. Anybody have a comment? I'm not going to introduce gun control today. We don't have time for that. We'll do the gun control next week. Yes.
So if it's not a question of science, it's a question of morals, which he touched on there. And what he's attempting to do is to tell you his morals are the right ones. And other people's morals, pro-life, pro-choice, are good. Science isn't, it's there, it's real. And the thing that's left is morals. And one group says my morals are better than yours. And our legal system, 6 people in Washington, D.C. said those 6 people's morals count for 340 million Americans.
Of course, that's what the choice people would say. You choose your own morality, and each person should therefore have the right to choose. Nobody says you should have an abortion. You don't have to have an abortion. China used to. My daughter-in-law's mother forced to have an abortion at 6 months of pregnancy. That's the job. But we don't apply that to something like murder. If you were torturing children, you could say, well, that's different values. One is we were following your value. That's what it is to the relativism thing. That's discussed in the book. You get into relativism, the different groups have different values. Right? At some point, we're all going to say, no, I'm not going to accept that. That's wrong. I insist on opposing my values. At some point, suppose you had a neighbor whose hobby was torturing children. He was screaming if the children was keeping you away. You'd say, well, he said, I'm sorry, it's keeping you awake. I'll do better soundproofing than my torture. So you're not bothered. None of us would accept that. We call the police. That's wrong. We don't think it's a matter of our opinion. I think people who don't believe in God and don't believe in religion, they still have things that they believe are morally right, that they oppose. The anti-abortion people think proposing abortion is something so wrong that they will impose that on people and force them to follow their view. Doesn't seem like that's the majority opinion, however. Yeah.
Isn't there something in here where religion comes into it? Because they're using some of their religion to emphasize things that science has proved wrong.
Well, sometimes religion says things that science has proved wrong, like people who say the earth was founded 6,000 years ago and there were dinosaurs on Noah's Ark with people. But I don't think that in abortion, it's not really something that's been proved wrong. It's a matter of, I think, the fact that male and female DNA are joined together means that that's sacrosanct and can't be avoided or not. Or does it have to be a sentient being? That's what people say with animals. For example, people who think animals should have rights, if they have feelings, if they feel pain, therefore we shouldn't be killing them, just eat them. You have those sorts of debates. It's not really that they're disagreeing about whether animals can feel pain. It's just saying, I think pain that they suffer is worth imposing so that I can have meat. My daughter disagrees. My son is in a Paleolithic diet, just eats meat. You get two kids raised in the same house and they come out with diametrically opposed values on that issue. And I don't see there's an explanation for it. Neither one of them is religious. But what's religion? If you have profound beliefs about the world, you believe certain things are wrong, maybe that's it's not religion, it's an equivalent, it's a secular religion or something.
Well, the one part was mentioned that his article about the apple was accepted and used in the Catholic schools.
In Catholic schools, I think they read that article. I don't think it would be in secular schools.
Do they read the scientific stuff? That's a question.
I don't know that much about Catholic schools. I assume they have biology courses and they learn about the nature of reproduction. I don't know. When I was in high school, we had sex education. We talk about sex. And say after the sperm fertilizes the egg, the cell. They wouldn't talk about how that's done. I suppose the biology textbooks cover this stuff. I don't know. I just had a Catholic education. I would know. In fact, if I taught in New Jersey, the majority were Catholic. Here it's all Protestants. Different religions reach different opinions about this issue, not about other issues like murder, for example. I mean, there's consensus about ethical things. Our time is over. It's 5:03. Next time we'll start with the gun control and we'll go on to false memory syndrome. Daycare scandals. Okay, folks, we're signing off here, so I'm going to close the Zoom, I think. We have to turn off the recording first.